In October 1787, John Thornton accompanied Richard Johnson on board the ship which would carry him to Sydney Harbour, giving him a copy of Cruden's Concordance, which is still held by Moore College Library today, and we're going to see it at lunchtime, I believe. In a letter to his friend, Reverend William Richardson, he reported, "The Botany Bay business is all settled, and dear Mr. Johnson is to embark with about 200 of his new congregation on board." Along with his concordance, Johnson also sailed with a cargo of other spiritual books and Bibles and parts of Bibles, which had been donated by Thornton and others through the SPCK. The contribution that John Thornton made to the cargo and the chaplaincy provision of the First Fleet is illustrative of the main thing that the Thornton family, John and his wife Lucy, their son Henry and his wife Marianne, are remembered for by evangelicals today. If they are remembered at all, it is chiefly, or perhaps exclusively, for the financial backing they provided to the evangelical movement and to the various reform projects that the members of the Clapham sect were involved in. In reality, the Thorntons' contribution to the Clapham sect went far beyond the money that they provided. If we had more time, we could explore all kinds of other ways in which they were integral to the group. But in this paper today, I will be focusing, as most do, on their money, how they regarded it, how they used it, the extent to which they were aware of the dangers that were attendant on the strategy that they followed for doing good, and the legacy, both positive and negative, that they bequeathed to us as Sydney evangelicals by their generous philanthropy and by the model of dangerous respectability that went hand in hand with it. The fortunes of the Thornton family were amassed over several generations across the 17th and 18th century, initially through their involvement in the hugely profitable North Sea export trade. As Stuart mentioned earlier, John Thornton was born in Clapham in 1720 and started adulthood with £100,000 and then inherited properties and business partnerships from his father. In 1753, he married Lucy Watson, who was the daughter of Samuel Watson, another wealthy merchant from Hull, who had partnered with the Thorntons and Wilberforces. Lucy brought to the marriage not only her inherited wealth, but also her firmly held evangelical convictions. As a dissenter, she had originally refused John's marriage proposal because he was not, in the words of their son Henry, of sufficiently religious character. She eventually accepted his proposal, and in the year after they married, John, influenced by Lucy's piety, embraced her form of vital Christianity, as evangelicals of their time described their version of the faith. Lucy and John had 4 children. Samuel headed the family's Baltic business and was a director of the Bank of England for 50 years. Jane married Alexander Leslie Melville, the 7th Earl of Leven. Robert was a director of the East India Company, and Henry was a banker and chaired the Sierra Leone Company. The 3 brothers were members of Parliament, along with their cousin William Wilberforce. John was not only wealthy, reputedly in his lifetime he was the 2nd richest man in Europe, he was also famously generous, estimated to have given away over £150,000 in his lifetime, which was the equivalent in purchasing power to about $33 million in today's money, according to my calculations. His son Henry calculated that his father usually gave away about £2,000 or £3,000 per annum. Much of the money John gave away was, in Henry's words, bestowed on those who had no other claim on his purse than that of compassion. John Newton remembered that on one occasion, when John Thornton left his vicarage at Oney, he gave him a sum of money for the poor and sick, saying, "Help the poor and needy. Keep open house for such as are deserving. I will allow you statedly 200 a year and will readily send whatever you may have occasion to draw and more. He founded and supported organisations which provided relief from poverty. Some of those are listed up there. He also invested in the printing of Bibles and religious tracts and organised their dissemination through their shipping companies. He helped to establish 2 evangelical colleges. He built Holy Trinity Clapham in 1775. His highest priority, though, was the support of evangelical ministers and the creation of positions for them. Because his influence did not always hold weight, given that he was viewed as a Methodist by many within the church, he simply bought of Aldsons the right to appoint the minister of a parish. And John Newton was appointed to St Mary Woolnoth in this way. Henry Thornton was the one child out of the 4 in his generation of the family who embraced the evangelicalism of his father, albeit a few years into his adulthood through the influence of his childhood friend William Wilberforce. It was Henry who was responsible for gathering the Clapham sect together at his home, Battersea Rise, on the west side of Clapham Common. He bought the property in 1792 and he shared the house with William Wilberforce until he married Marianne Sykes in 1796. Marianne was the daughter of another Hull merchant, Joseph Sykes, and was also a cousin of William Wilberforce. You can see the family tree up there. She was an evangelical too, having been converted by Henry 6 years earlier. Their home and its surrounding properties became the centre of their friendship and political networks. Henry inherited from his father not only wealth and evangelical faith, but also a strong commitment to the value of philanthropy and gospel patronage. He respected his father's generosity and emulated this quality in him, desiring to pass this on to his children. He said, "I would earnestly suggest to my children to be limited in their expenses and large in their liberality. The example which I bequeath to them in this respect is of more real value than a magnificent fortune, and it is an example which was bequeathed to me by my father." Henry and Marianne gave generously to an even greater variety of causes and organisations than his father. They helped form Sunday schools and invested in the publication of Bibles and religious tracts. Henry was also the chief financial supporter of the Ellen Society, which put young men of piety and talent, such as Samuel Marsden, through university. The Ellen Society morphed into the Society for Missions to Africa, which later became the Church Missionary Society. And Henry served as treasurer in many of these organisations as well. But Henry's attitudes to faith and money were not identical to those of his father. In his recollections, a written memoir that he wrote to pass down to his children, he was critical of his father on a number of issues. Henry had strong opinions amongst many on his father's use of money. John had been known for his frugality. Henry had been deeply embarrassed at the extent of his parents' tendency to economise. He'd experienced the shame of his family being looked down in a variety of social contexts because of their unfashionable clothing and lack of other luxuries, which were the norm for their social class. It didn't help also that John was viewed suspiciously because of his Methodist connections. So Henry was determined to take a different approach to his dad. When he married Marianne, the issue of money came up as they discussed the renovations of the house that they were to live in, and the question of whether to buy a new carriage. Marianne wrote to her mother, "The only specimen of matrimonial jarring we have had was in my persisting that the drawing room in King's Arms Yard should not be new furnished. We have, however, compromised the matter, and it is to be half done. We have Hatchett is building a coach, of which the original price was 300 guineas. But by divesting it of many useless ornaments, it will not cost quite £300. I see objects starving around me, and I'm shocked at all this. But Mr. T tells me we must do good both to the bodies and souls of men, and that to gain an influence over the minds of our equals is perhaps most necessary, which cannot be done if we are not equally free from austerity and ostentation. Through the careful management of his business, Henry was able to increase his wealth beyond that even of his father, growing his income to £12,000 per annum. In his disbursement of that income, he was still far more generous than his peers in supporting charitable causes. But he was also very careful to lay capital aside to ensure a substantial inheritance for his children. In his philanthropic activity too, Henry took an approach that was different from his father's. In Henry's view, his father had been insufficiently discerning in the choices that he had made about the objects of his generosity, with the consequence that some of those he patronised had deceived him, and he had ended up being unwittingly favourable to some unworthy characters. A good deal of John's success, both in philanthropy and in business, had been, in Henry's opinion, the product more of good luck or favourable providence than good management. He said, "My father is an instance of how much a man with the blessing of God may do, who is without learning, without any very strong judgment, without political influence, without associates of his own rank in life to support him in his labour, provided he has the interest of religion at his heart, is active in his disposition, bountiful in bestowing the wealth which Providence has given him, and unrestrained by the fear of his fellow creatures." Henry was determined to be more careful and more strategic, to be better connected, with more political influence and more associates of his own class, and to train his sons to follow in a similar path. In contrast with his father's profusion of interests and activities as a jack of all trades, in his words, he focused his business energies on the banking industry and was deliberate in his attempts to make money. Henry's approach to philanthropy was consistent with his approach to the family's business activities. Money was not to be given away at random as a kind of knee-jerk reaction. It was to be invested strategically and purposefully to achieve the beneficial uses to which it is convertible. His charitable giving was carefully budgeted. In a 1799 letter to Hannah More, he wrote, we won't show that yet. "I'm now, thank God, so rich in charity money as to be desirous of giving you £10 or £10 over and above for any clergy, etc., into whose hands you may wish it to be put. I think I shall have to give in my income at about £9,000, and I have economised my charity so as to be offering about to different persons £100 or £200. In response to a request later from Hannah More to support her writing project, one of her cheap repository tracts, Marianne wrote to her explaining that your new plans have been a good deal discussed among us. A little money seems to go so far in your hands that I have just abolished a great Sunday school in the borough that I might have something more to send you. We have entered on your work, for I do not quite yet know what is to be its title. Mr. T is much pleased with its great liveliness and thinks it must take." In another letter to Hannah More, sent in 1805, she wrote, "My dear friend, we received by the day's post the £100 which you have returned. I hope you are really quite at ease without it, or I shall fear that you have limited your exertions because you might occasionally hear me grumble at the misapplied or importunate requests of others to be assisted out of our purse. I entreat this may never be remembered by you, for other cases hold no comparison with yours, because Mr. T and I always think ourselves much obliged to you for spending any part of our money better in any respect than we can do ourselves. Mr. T sends his best regards and begs I will say that he's very rich at present." The approach that Henry followed in his quest to do good both to the bodies and souls of men involved not only the strategic accumulation and disbursement of wealth, but also the pursuit and exercise of political influence. In an 1801 letter to Marianne, the divine blessings that he listed as causes for thanksgiving included not only a religious circle of true and kind friends, abundance of wealth, and opportunities of usefulness, but also, in some quarters, a growing sort of reputation with the world. One key element in this strategy, as already mentioned, was the provision of funds to enable gifted young evangelicals with prospects for influential ministries within the Church of England to gain the respectability that was conferred by Cambridge education. If the evangelical movement was to change the nation, it needed to have its champions installed in powerful positions within the national church. In an 1807 letter to Hannah More's sister Paddy, he rejoiced in the successes that this venture was achieving. Young men of piety and talents are rising up. The gospel, I hope a better gospel than that of mere Methodism, spreads, and especially in the church. Among the rising generation, I trust God will have a large seed to serve him. Many of us are wearing out, but I expect a better race of Christians to come after us, who will also have the advantage of building on our foundation. Henry monitored the results of those men closely and was keenly aware of the social and political dimensions of his gospel patronage. In an 1811 letter, he commented to Hannah More, "Have you heard how well the saints have come off in the last Cambridge examination? We are quite advancing in the wisdom of this world, but I presume that we are to be the more persecuted for this, because by becoming a little more respectable, we become much more dangerous." Henry's letter to Hannah More makes it clear that he was keenly aware of how dangerous their strategy would be perceived as being for rival parties within the Parliament and the Church of England. But the strategy of gaining respectability through the pursuit of influence and position was dangerous not only for the enemies of evangelicalism, it also held dangers for the evangelicals themselves, and not just that danger of being persecuted by their enemies. Mary Ann's family was wealthy in its own right. But when she married Henry, she commented to her father in a letter on the size of Henry's property and the large budget of £3,000 per annum he had set aside for domestic expenses. After commenting on how richly she would be provided for, she said, "My great danger will be of being spoilt too much by prosperity and indulgence and of growing proud by being placed at the head of a crowd of dependents, persuading me that they lived only on my smiles." Henry too was conscious of the risk of worldliness that money brought with it. He wrote to Mary Ann, "I feel danger in growing both covetous and worldly by being so very much of a banker, and need a Sunday for self-examination on this and other subjects." As their children grew older, Henry's letters provide a revealing insight into the anxiety he and Mary Ann felt concerning the influence on them of the extravagance and carelessness of their peers. In a letter to Mary Ann in 1803, he assured her that pointing the children to the wise and safe path will soon be one of the chief things to which I shall aspire. 10 years later, when criticising his class for partaking the luxuries of both mind and table without appreciating the efforts of those who provided them, his mind quickly turned to his own children, some of whom were nearing adulthood by this stage. He said, "It is one of my great wishes to secure my daughters from some of these idols of the tribe, but it is hard to do it, so inveterate are the habits of thinking on every side of them." For Henry and Mary Ann, the public downfall of Henry's older brother, Robert, was a terrifying reminder of the perils of wealth and privilege. In 1814, Robert's bankruptcy was announced in the London papers, with the shocking news that he owed £45,000 to his creditors. Robert fled to France, leaving his wife and children behind, and never returned, dying under an assumed name in the US in 1826. Henry and Marianne had always disapproved of Robert's extravagant lifestyle, and 4 years before the scandal, Henry wrote to Hannah More about the forced sale of Robert's lavish property at Clapham. There's a quote from the letter and a picture of the property on the screen. Fearful as they were about the spiritual dangers that wealth and privilege posed for them and their children, there were limits to the limits to the measures that they could countenance for combating those risks. They prayed daily and earnestly. They committed themselves to serious self-examination. They conversed with their children, pointing them to the wise and safe path. They gave money away consistently and generously, but they also clung tenaciously to the rank and respectability that their wealth brought with it. They shunned social connections with their inferiors. They took it as a given that their children's circle of associates would be composed of their social equals and that their eventual marriage partners would come from within their caste. And whilst they were generous philanthropists and tireless campaigners for causes such as the abolition of slavery, they were strenuously opposed to political reforms that would disturb the social hierarchy and diminish the privileges of rank within their own country. The respectability that they were anxious to preserve for themselves and to acquire for the evangelical party more broadly was a two-edged sword, creating enormous opportunities to do good to the bodies and souls of men and grave dangers for them and for those who came after them. As it turned out, very few of their own children and the children of the other members of the Clapham Circle inherited the evangelical faith of their parents. Gertrude Himmelfarb famously chronicled the successful diminution of the religious faith among the descendants of the Clapham sect across the second half of the 19th century. The defection from evangelicalism was most spectacular among the Wilberforce boys, but a similar trend was observable among the Thorntons and most of the other Clapham families. One poignant instance of that in the Thorntons' case can be seen in the way that Henry and Marianne are remembered by their great-grandson, E.M. Forster, who portrayed them in the biography that he wrote of their eldest daughter, Marianne. He does not present them very favourably. The legacy left by the Thornton family to the evangelical movement in Sydney was enormous and mixed. They contributed a large proportion of the financial backing that made it possible for Richard Johnson and Samuel Marsden to be appointed as chaplains in Sydney. They paid for the Bibles and tracts that were to be sent with the First Fleet and in successive shipments in the following years. The influence of Henry Thornton in Parliament and his close connections to Pitt the Younger and William Wilberforce helped to ensure an evangelical chaplaincy in New South Wales. The organisations and institutions the Thorntons helped establish made lasting contributions to the shape of evangelicalism in Sydney. The Bible Society, for example, was responsible for sending thousands of Bibles to the colony of New South Wales, and eventually, in March 1817, at the urging of Elizabeth Macquarie, the Auxiliary Bible Society of New South Wales was formed, with Governor Lachlan Macquarie in the chair and evangelicals like the Reverend William Cowper of St Philip's on the committee. A couple of weeks after the first meeting of the Bible Society, the Bank of New South Wales opened for business. Every member of the First Bank Board was also a member of the Bible Society Committee, reflecting the close connections between Christianity and commerce that were a key part of the Thorntons' legacy. The first secretary of the Bank of New South Wales was Edward Smith Hall. He was an evangelical who had arrived in the colony in 1811, actually at the request that Samuel Marsden had sent back home, asking for more evangelical men to come to Sydney. And he arrived with letters of recommendation from Wilberforce and Henry Thornton. As the son of a private banker back home in London, he was an admirer of Henry Thornton. As editor of the Sydney Monitor in the following decades, he would repeatedly refer to Thornton's famous essay on paper credit to support his own economic arguments, addressing events such as the liquidity crisis of 1826. Hall had also been a founding member of the first charitable institution in the colony, along with 5 others, including Cowper again, pictured there. He founded the New South Wales Society for Promoting Christian Knowledge and Benevolence in 1813, soon after his arrival, and this was eventually replaced by the Benevolent Society of New South Wales, which was actually established at the Bible Society AGM in May 1818. Their legacy was enormous, and their impact for good and for the gospel was immense and enduring. But the tensions and dangers inherent in the strategy that they followed and the ethos that they engendered were real too. Samuel Marsden, one of their chief proteges, not only contributed to the propagation of the gospel in New South Wales and across the South Pacific region, he also went down in history as the flogging parson because of the vigour with which he exercised his authority as a magistrate, and he gained notoriety for the rapacity with which he exploited the opportunities that a penal colony created for his own personal enrichment. His conflict with Governor Lachlan Macquarie stemmed largely from his unwavering commitment to the preservation of rank and respectability, and his fierce opposition to Macquarie's policy of enlarging opportunities for the rehabilitation of emancipists. In this respect, actually, he was closer in his opinions to the Thorntons than to Wilberforce, who was a strong supporter of Macquarie's policy, as was Macquarie's evangelical wife, Elizabeth. Not all of the evangelical clergy in the colony adopted the same views as Marsden. We've already heard, or they all had the same degree of proximity to power. We've heard from Mark about Richard Johnson's struggles with the governor and lieutenant governor. We know William Cowper firmly rejected the requests of Macquarie and his predecessors to serve as a magistrate. The majority of evangelical clergy did not follow Marsden's example of enlarging their personal fortunes, and few were as committed as Marsden to protecting the boundaries of rank and social respectability. But there was still something about the pattern of respectable, well-funded evangelical ministry with proximity to power and the backing of generous philanthropy that was an undeniable element of the legacy that the Thornton family and the Clapham sect more broadly bequeathed to the evangelicalism of Sydney. So many aspects of the institutions and ethos of Sydney evangelicalism that we take for granted today were the direct or indirect legacy of the work of the Thorntons. The Thorntons' immense investment in the gospel yielded dividends that multiplied across the decades within and beyond their own lifetime. And their influence and example played a key role in shaping the distinctive ethos of evangelicalism in this city, contributing both to its capacity for social and spiritual good and to the real and serious risks that such a powerful and privileged expression of Christian faith is invariably exposed to. We are their heirs in more ways than one, and we would do well to know their story and take both inspiration and warning from it.
Fantastic. Thanks, Nicole, so much. What a fascinating family. We've got a couple of questions, both surprise about money and the Thorntons. Mr. T, I love that quote from Mr. T, begs that I say that he's very rich at present. Fantastic. Here are a couple of questions. One, did Henry's desire to be of his societal class in comparison to his father directly impact his children's not carrying on the Clapham sect? So his desire to be of the same class as his father, how did that impact?
So the desire to be in that social class.
Yeah.
It's very hard to judge exactly what contributed to this. Looking at their letters, I think that they were great parents, actually, I should say that. It's wonderful to read their letters. It's all a bit complicated by the fact that they did die so young. So I didn't get to mention that. Actually, Henry and Marianne died in their early 50s, and the children were still teenagers or even younger. I think I think actually, I think the fact that they were located in that class, and Henry was definitely more determined to make them fit within the class than he had experienced. I think that may have contributed to the fact that they were still, I think as Stuart said, within that intellectual aristocracy, they still had so much influence in British culture. But they did start to abandon the evangelicalism. They sort of, I think that Himmelfarb, it's a great article if you're interested. Gertrude Himmelfarb talks about how they stayed with the morality in the next generation, and by the third generation they'd sort of, but they neglected the evangelical distinctives of their parents, and then by the third generation they'd sort of abandon everything, morality and the key features of evangelicalism. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Okay. Look, one question is to wrap it up off the back of that one. How did these wealthy Christians view the dovetailing of money and religion with the Bible's warning against greed? There's a related question. What can we learn about this from wealth? That might be a little bit much to say. But what do you see in their writings or thinking about the Bible's teaching on greed?
I think they were very conscious of what the Bible said about greed. They gave away so much money and they thought a lot about the way that how to use their money, but also how to stay within that social class. I think so. I think for them, they were quite deliberately thinking. As he was sort of explaining to Marianne as they were deciding whether to get a carriage or not, they needed to be able to relate to people within the same social class whilst not holding on to that money in the same way as perhaps his brother Robert was doing. So they were very conscious of that, but this is in a class structure that they really did believe had been ordained by God. So that was their commitment there as well, yeah.
Fantastic. Well, thanks. Can we thank Nicole again for those questions and answers?